Hello everyone, and thank you for joining my Microsoft Teams Architecture Deep Dive at the Scottish Summit. I'd like to start with a big shout out to all the sponsors because they make sure that events like this, free events for you as an attendee, are possible. So please make sure that you check out all their websites and interact with them. My name is Maarten Eekels. I'm the Chief Digital Officer of Portiva, a Microsoft consultancy company based in the Netherlands, and we focus on Microsoft Cloud implementations. I'm also a Microsoft MVP and I'm also a Microsoft Regional Director. And if you would like to interact with me, you can do that in the app, of course, of the Scottish Summit, but you can also send me a tweet, reach out to me on Twitter, and I'll make sure that I'll answer your questions that you have. All right, now let's dive into the content of this session. And I want to start with the logical architecture of Microsoft Teams. So this is you as a person. And when you are in Teams, you can chat. There's two sections, big sections in Microsoft Teams where you can chat with people one-on-one or one-on-many group chats, or a little bit more structured where you have teams and you can interact and have conversations in channels. But we start on the personal side, on the chat side. And nowadays you can also have tabs and apps in chat. And of course, as you are all aware, I assume, when you share a file in a chat conversation in Microsoft Teams, that file is being stored in the OneDrive for Business of the person sharing the file. So it's not being copied to other OneDrive for Businesses or other environments. It's being put in that particular OneDrive for Business. And if we look further, then you have your contacts in Microsoft Teams. They're being stored in a separate store in Teams. And of course you have your messages with the images, emojis, stickers and recordings. When you have a meeting, the recording is being stored in separate storage systems inside Microsoft Teams, in Azure basically. And we'll talk a bit more about that later on in this presentation. And then of course there is meetings and calling and even voicemail. If you have configured that, you can receive voicemail messages in Microsoft Teams. And Teams is doing a lot these last couple of months in terms of calling, call forwarding, group calling, etc. That's all being added to the Microsoft Teams stack. And then the biggest part. This is where you can have conversations or share files or collaborate with your coworkers in a team and in channels. And what you can see here is what is important to know is that every team has an underlying construct underneath it. It's called an Office 365 group, or nowadays actually it's called a Microsoft 365 group. And this is a construct with members and owners. And it's the same members and owners as your team has. But that construct, you can use that construct in other places in Office 365 as well. For example, you can use it in SharePoint to give permissions to certain sites, or even the same site that is attached to the team that you have created. The same group is being used to set out permissions there. But you can also use it in Microsoft Stream or in Power BI or in Dynamic CRM. So other workloads, other platforms within Office 365. And every group is attached to a team, but also every team has a SharePoint site, like I just mentioned. And within the SharePoint site, there is a document library, and for every channel that you create in your team, a separate folder is created in that document library. And it's a little bit tricky because members of your team have the permissions to change these folders, the names of the folders. They can delete the folders, they can change the hierarchy of the folder, so maybe drag a folder inside another folder. And Teams will not look at that and will not take that into account the next time you open up your team or your channel. So when someone removes a folder in SharePoint and someone else goes to that same channel or to the Files tab in that channel in Teams, the folder is being recreated. And then when people have dropped, maybe drag and dropped a folder inside another folder, and then suddenly there's a new folder with the same name, or they renamed the folder and they're like, hey, why is that folder back? So this could cause some confusion. So it's good to explain this to your users, but that's just the way that Microsoft Teams works. And nowadays, with the private channels that have arrived about a year ago, it's also possible to create a private channel in Teams, and a private channel will not create a separate folder, but it will create an entire new site in SharePoint. So every private channel has its own dedicated SharePoint site attached to it. And if you want to know which SharePoint sites are bound or are attached to these private folders, you can use PowerShell, you can use the SharePoint Online commandlets for that, and you can search for the team channel -0. That's a template ID, and you can use template IDs to get an overview of all the teams, of all the sites, I should say, that have this particular template ID attached to it. And that's how you can find out which SharePoint sites are basically or are actually sites that are attached to a private channel. And of course, within the private channels, you can also have the tabs. And again, all the messages that you have in a channel are stored in the message store. And like I said, we'll talk about where everything is stored a bit later on. If we look at the technical architecture of Microsoft Teams, we can see that there are a lot of components in the backend running in the services architecture of Microsoft Teams that basically make sure that Teams works as it works for you. So on the front end, we have the web and the desktop app and the different mobile apps, but of course also the Graph API, which we will also talk about today. But in the back end, there are a lot of services, and most of these services are existing services. The OneNote service or the Office service, the SharePoint, OneDrive for Business, Exchange, etc., that already existed. And a couple of these services come from the Skype for Business architecture as well. So these are also services that already existed. But Teams has introduced a couple of new services as well. And we see the connectors, which already existed in Office 365 groups as well. We see Exchange, we see search here, calling and meeting. But one particular one that I'd like to point out is the experimentation service. And that particular service decides if you get a certain feature in your client or not. If your environment, your tenant, receives a certain feature or not. So the code for all the clients is basically the same, but the experimentation feature decides if you get a feature or not. So that's interesting, the way that they set this up. And also interesting to note here is that outside the whole technical architecture of Microsoft Teams, there's also an email service which sends and receives emails through an SMTP service. If you enable incoming email on a channel, which you can do, you will notice that the email domain for that email address that channel receives is not your own domain. It's actually a Microsoft domain. So it uses its own SMTP service to bring in emails that are being emailed to a channel into your channel. And then there's the telemetry service, also running outside your own Microsoft Teams architecture. So Microsoft is getting a lot of telemetry from the Teams services. That's all anonymized, so they can't see you as a person or your co-workers. They can't see what they are doing individually, but they do aggregate telemetry in order to make sure that the service runs as it should run, and in order to see what the trends are and if they need to invest in additional architecture or in additional underlying machines for their architecture. So where's everything stored? The interesting thing that Microsoft did is they figured, okay, if we need to store everything for Microsoft Teams, we also need to make sure that all the compliance features and all the security features that we already have in place for other Office 365 services, for example, Exchange and SharePoint, we need to have those features for Microsoft Teams as well, because our customers want those features. Compliance is a strong thing about Microsoft and all the features that they have around compliance and security. So it makes sense that you would want all those features for your Teams service as well. And that's where Microsoft figured, okay, we can create a storage for Microsoft Teams and then make sure that all the features work on that storage, or, and that's basically what they did, we can leverage existing platforms within Office 365 to make sure that all the compliance features work. So that's why they store the messages and the images and the recordings in two different places, especially the messages, I should say. They are being stored in their own table storage, which is moving to Cosmos DB, by the way. And for chat, that already happened. And for Teams, for channel messages, that's still an ongoing project. So in the back end, all the chat messages and all the channel messages are being stored and are going to be stored in Cosmos DB. And that's for performance reasons. But Cosmos DB doesn't have a mechanism for e-discovery or for DLP, and Exchange has. So what also happens is that a copy of that message is being ingested into Exchange. So when you chat with someone else in Microsoft Teams, there is a hidden folder in your Exchange mailbox which also stores all the Microsoft Teams messages. And that folder in your Exchange mailbox is capable of listening to all the compliance features that Microsoft has in Office 365. And the same with channel messages. The channel messages are also copied or ingested into Exchange in the shared mailbox that is attached to the Office 365 group that was created for that particular team. So that's good to know. And then the images, they are stored in their own blob storage in Azure, but they're also ingested into Exchange. Files, we already talked about that. The team files are all stored in SharePoint and the chat files are all stored in OneDrive for Business. Voicemails are being stored in Exchange. And recordings, that's an interesting one, because when you record a meeting inside Microsoft Teams, that recording is being stored in Azure for a maximum of 24 hours. And basically, most of the times that's way less than 24 hours. That's the time that Microsoft, according to its SLA, can use to encode that recording and put it in Microsoft Stream. Well, at least it was supposed to go to Microsoft Stream. It went to Microsoft Stream until January of this year, because then Microsoft made it possible to store your recordings in OneDrive and SharePoint. And right now you still have to enable that through PowerShell. You can enable it, and then you can see it's still in a preview feature. So all the recordings will then be stored in OneDrive for Business and in SharePoint. But very soon that will be the standard. And then all meeting recordings will be stored in OneDrive and SharePoint. And why did Microsoft make that decision? Well, that's again for the same reasons as we just mentioned before for the messages, because OneDrive and SharePoint already have all the compliance features and already have the instruments in place, for example, to allow guest access. Because before, when the recordings were still stored in Microsoft Stream, guest users that could have been part of the meeting could not access the recording, because Microsoft Stream doesn't have the capabilities of allowing guest users to access the files that are stored in Microsoft Stream. All right, calendar meetings, they're stored in the individual mailbox. Contacts are in Exchange, and of course telemetry that we talked about as well. Now, we know where things are stored right now, but there's also interaction with other platforms, mechanisms, services outside the compliance boundary of Microsoft Teams. And that's where this image, this diagram comes in play. So here we have Microsoft Teams in the center, and there is, with certain services, there's data going outbound, so only outbound data going to other services. And there's also inbound data, but most of these services, they have two-way communication. And a couple of those are quite obvious, right? If you go to the browser, if you go to the desktop app, if you go to the mobile app, if you want to access Microsoft Teams, yeah, it's obvious that the data arrives in that app. But it does cross the service boundaries. It does go over your internet connection. And of course, it's all secured over HTTPS connections, and TLS is being used. But still, the data is on the move, and it's leaving the compliance boundary within the data centers of Microsoft, of the Microsoft data centers. So I'm not saying that this is a bad thing, but at least when you want to have a conversation with your customers, or when you work at an organization that feels that compliance is really, really important and they want to know where the data is going, this could be a useful diagram, because this shows you where data is going, where data is coming from, and both ways maybe, and at least you can have that conversation. All right, let's move on to the client architecture. There is a Teams client, we all know that, and the Teams client from the beginning has been available for both Windows and for Mac, and it's also available in the web. And with web we mean the web browser. And of course in the desktop client Microsoft uses Electron, as most of you know. And the reason that they chose to use Electron is because in Electron they could implement some features to use your camera, your microphone, etc., to make sure that some of the things work better. Because as you might know as well, there in the Windows app and in the Mac app, there are a little bit more features than in the web browser. Although the web browser is getting better and better, but still the Windows, there are certain features that are only available in the Windows or in the Mac app. And there Microsoft uses a shared code base which is based on HTML5 and CSS. And when they started with Microsoft Teams, everything was built on Angular, because Angular was the de facto standard within Microsoft for all web applications. They had the most knowledge about Angular, and so that's why they decided to start in Angular. But in the meantime, things have changed within Microsoft, and Microsoft is using React more and more. Also within SharePoint, the SharePoint framework, and the SharePoint framework, which is now also being used for Teams. Of course, you can still use Angular there, but the default has basically become React. And Microsoft is moving some of the code from their desktop app to React as well. And there are a lot of components and services behind there. On the mobile side, there's a difference, of course, between the iOS app and the Android app, but still they try to use as much of the code base as possible to share that in both environments. Now, what you need to know and what you need to realize is that all the apps, the desktop apps, the mobile apps, Microsoft uses an auto update mechanism in those apps. So it's different from Word or Excel or PowerPoint or Outlook, because that's easier to manage when a user in your environment or a coworker or a colleague, when they receive an update. So within Teams you have less of control on when people will receive an update. The app auto updates, and Microsoft does that intentionally so that they can guarantee more the stability and the feature parity within apps between the users. And we already talked about that experimentation service, and that decides which feature is being enabled in your client and which not. Browser support, that's an interesting one, because IE 11 support has already ended. So that's good to know. And Microsoft Teams is a little bit ahead of all the other Office 365 services. Because for all the other Office 365 services, IE 11 support will end August 17 of this year. But for Teams, it already has ended. And also interesting to know is that Edge Legacy, in the meantime we have received Edge Chromium. Microsoft is now using the Chromium engine for their Edge browser. And so the other one, the old one, is now called Edge Legacy. And Edge Legacy support for that will also stop quite soon. That will end on March 9th of this year. So keep that in mind. If you still have customers or in your organization Edge Legacy is still being used, or even IE 11, then please realize that it's no longer being supported by Microsoft. So if you run into issues, you will not receive any support, or they will tell you, yeah, you should use a modern browser. All right, let's switch gears a little bit. We've talked a little bit about the architecture and the logical and technical architecture. Now let's have a look at more of the manageability capabilities of Microsoft Teams. So first of all, membership and roles. There are three types of memberships that a team can have. You have the owner, of course, and you have the member also, of course, but you also have guests. And what you have to realize is that an owner can basically do almost everything that is being highlighted here in this table. So the only thing that you can restrict from a tenant perspective is deletion of messages. So if you want to make sure that people cannot delete channel messages inside a team, that's something that you can set, you can create a policy for that on a tenant level. But everything else, a team owner is capable of doing within a team. So they have quite some power to manage their team. And by default, many of these things are also possible for team members. But here, a team owner can decide if a team member is allowed to do that or not. So by default, a team member will be capable of creating channels, deleting channels, updating a channel, creating a private channel, etc. Add tabs, connectors, etc. That's all possible for a team member. But it's up to the team owner to decide if they want to allow that or not. So if they don't want to allow that, then you could go to the team settings and change that. These are also settings that you can change programmatically. So if you have a provisioning mechanism to create a new team, maybe you don't want to use the normal creation button, but you want to use a formal request form, and maybe you have something as Power Automate or Azure Logic Apps behind it, then you can also use code or PowerShell to make sure that when a team is created, some of these features are already switched off for team members. And then, of course, there's team guests, and they, fortunately, I guess, they have many less capabilities within a Microsoft team, but still a couple. And it's up to you, again, as a team owner, to decide if you would like these guests to be able to create channels or not, for example. So these are all things that you might want to keep in mind when you create a team, or if you want to automate team creation and make sure that certain features are enabled or disabled by default. When we have a look at the team's admin roles, there are quite a couple of roles available in Azure AD that you can assign to people, to users, to make sure that they can help in managing the environment. Of course, you have the global admin. The global admin I didn't mention here, but there's always the tenant global admin who can who has access to all the workloads, to all the admin pages, to all the services and configuration options. And of course, the global admin can access everything. But if you want to kind of make sure that maybe you have a certain group of people that you want to be able to manage Teams as a service and nothing else, then you can do that. There is a Teams service administrator who can also manage and create Office 365 groups, but they can also go to the Teams admin center, change policies there, or use PowerShell to change configuration settings, etc. If you want to trim down the capabilities of an administrator even more, there are 4 separate roles that are more focused on the communication, on meeting and communication part of Teams, and not so much on the channel and conversation part of Teams. So the communication administrator, the communication support engineer, and the communication support specialist each have certain capabilities, becoming less in the order that I just mentioned. And these are roles that you can assign to people in your support team, and they can then help troubleshoot certain issues that arise within the meeting and calling capabilities of Microsoft Teams. And the device administrator is also, I would say, focused on meetings, because it is about meeting devices, meeting room devices, etc. If you would like a certain people to have only the role that they can manage devices, then that role is available. You can use that. And the last one, also an interesting one, is the group administrator. And the group administrator doesn't really have any very Teams specific capabilities, but they do have some governance setting capabilities, because some of the governance capabilities of Teams are not really attached to Teams, but are more attached to the Microsoft 365 groups that we just talked about as well. And a group administrator can, for example, create groups, manage groups, but also settings like naming and expiration policies that we will cover later on in this session as well. All right, let's switch gears again and move to all the different settings that we have available inside Microsoft Teams. And we start with settings on the tenant level. There's a lot of settings that you can control here. When you go to the admin center of Microsoft Teams, this is what you can control. But please keep in mind that whatever you configure here supersedes everything that an owner wants to configure on a team level. So my advice is to allow as much as possible here on a tenant level, so that you can go to an individual team and there restrict more if you want to. But if there are certain teams where maybe you want to allow a little bit more freedom because the teams are more about fun or are more about, I don't know, not a very structured way of communication, and you want to allow more possibilities and more fun in those teams, if you downsize the capabilities here, if you switch features off here, you cannot enable them on a team level. But the other way around is possible. So if you switch them on here, you can still switch them off on a team level. Email integration, I think that's an interesting one. Do you want to allow users to be able to send emails to channels? There's a lot of requests for this from my perspective. Many customers that I talk to, they like this feature. And that's okay, but if you switch this on, then at least think about, do you want everyone to be able to send emails to a channel? So what you could do is here insert a couple of domains, and you only accept emails from these domain names. So this could be your own domain name for your own organization, and perhaps a couple of organizations that you partner with or that you intensely work together with, and then just whitelist those domains and leave everything else out, so that you are less prone to receiving spam messages, for example, inside the channel. Here you also have the option to switch on file sharing options for different services. So by default, when you go to the Files tab, every file is being stored in SharePoint. But if you, as an organization, also maybe have Dropbox licenses or Box, or you use Google Drive, you can switch this on here in the tenant and have these services available in the Files tab of a certain team. Also nice, the email invitation. This is relatively new, a couple of months old, but already available for quite some time. This is a very interesting way to customize the email invitation, especially when you allow guest users. If you invite a person externally, an external user in your Teams environment, by default the email is very Microsoft branded. So here you can change some things, some settings. You can insert your own logo. You can insert a help URL or a legal URL that you would like people to be able to click and to see the agreements of the terms on which you provide guest access to your external users. So this is where you can configure this. And then there's the Teams policy, and the Teams policy used to have two options, but nowadays there's only one, and within the Teams policy you can decide on a tenant level if you want to allow private channels or not. And before you could also set and change the setting if you want private teams to be discoverable or not. And then you could still go to a private team and go to the settings and change there if you would want that private team to be discoverable or not. But I think it was November last year, Microsoft changed that. They removed this option. The documentation is gone as well on docs.microsoft.com. There was documentation about this feature. It's nowhere to be found anymore. And now all the private teams are not discoverable. So public teams are discoverable, private teams are not. And there's, for now, no way that you can change that. So good to know. So then we move to the team level. So on the team level, we can change a lot of the settings that we also had on the tenant level. So the fun stuff, everything about fun stuff, some member permissions, etc. So if we look at the member permissions, then you can see that here you can decide if members are allowed to add or remove apps, for example. Do you want them to be able to create channels? So this is where you can set that for an individual team. And then there's also the team code option, and I really like that one. Here you can generate a code, and you can do that for private teams as well. And then when you share this code, people who go to the screen where they can join or create a new team, there's also the option to type in an invitation code. And this invitation code, when they type in that invitation code, they automatically become a member of that team. So it's a very useful way to invite people and not go through manually inviting people and finding the right people to invite. Then the last level is the channel level. You can also change some settings on the channel level. First, I would like to point out that there is relatively new channel information and statistics. So that's very useful. So a team owner can go to the channel and have a look at the engagement within that particular channel. I think that's a very nice addition from Microsoft. But this is also the place where you can change channel moderation. And I think that's very interesting as well. So you can enable channel moderation. By default, it's switched off. And if you enable it, then the team owners, but you can add regular members as well. So here you see who are the moderators. If you click the manage button, you can add individual users. And then they are the only people who can, for example, create new messages in a certain team. So I think that's very useful. All right, then we move to PowerShell. It is possible to manage your team's environment with PowerShell. And in order to be able to do that, you need to install a module. So install module, name Microsoft Teams, and then you can run some Teams commandlets. For example, you can search for a team, you can get the team. So in this case, I did a get team with the display name of Scottish Summit. And here you can see all the options that are enabled for this particular team. There are more, but the screenshot was becoming too big, too large. So I cut it down to only a couple of the properties of that particular team. But here you see the sticker and meme setting, the custom meme setting, allow guests, create, update channels, etc. So all the options, all the settings that you have on a Teams level from the UI, you can also change this in Microsoft Teams, in PowerShell. And that's again very useful if you want to use PowerShell for provisioning or to change settings in your environment for a group of teams. All right, external guest access. This was by default off for existing tenants until this month actually. So on February 6th, Microsoft changed the setting to on for tenants. So all the tenants that did not explicitly set this to on or off, if you have never touched this setting, then it was, the service default was off, and Microsoft has changed this now to a service default for on. So if you never touch the setting, keep in mind that for your tenant, guest access is now enabled. And for all the new tenants that will be created, guest access will be enabled as well. But interestingly, even though it was switched off on the tenant level, it was already switched on for the individual teams. So when you decided to enable this setting and this feature on a tenant level, then you had to realize that all the teams that you had already created on beforehand suddenly were capable of inviting external guest users. So maybe you have an HR team or a legal team or some top secret project team that you absolutely want to be sure about, that external guests cannot be invited for that particular team. That is possible, but you have to use PowerShell in order to switch that off for that particular team. So here you see the PowerShell commandlets, and I will share my slide deck later on as well through Twitter. But here you see the commandlets that you can use to switch off guest access on a team level. And until a couple of months ago, that was only possible with PowerShell, but nowadays we also have the sensitivity labels. So in Microsoft Admin Center, or the Compliance Center, I should say, of Microsoft 365, you can create sensitivity labels. That was already possible, but now it's also possible to create sensitivity labels for Microsoft 365 groups. So here you can see the Office 365 group connected team site. Do we want to be able to make this private, or do we want to stick to public? This is where you can set that up. So you can create a label, and then based on that label, if people choose that label, you can decide, okay, for this label, then the team has to be private. Or people can still choose. It can be private or public, that's both okay. And here you also see the option, let Office 365 group owners add people outside the organization to the group. So here you decide if you want to allow that or not if you use a label. All right, time for a quick demo. So here I have Microsoft Teams, and now I'm going to create a team. So if I wanted to create a new team, I can click create from scratch, and here you see the option with the sensitivity label. So if you have configured the sensitivity labels in your compliance center, then you will get a drop down of the available sensitivity labels. So here I have public, internal, or confidential. And let's, for example, click internal, and now you see that I cannot choose public anymore, and I cannot choose org-wide anymore. So now I have to select private in order to create that team. And when I do create this team, also I'm no longer able to invite external guest users for this particular team. So using these labels can be a very useful way to manage guest user access or to manage discoverability of groups, for example. So if you want to maybe internal, you can still choose between private and public, but if it is confidential, then I absolutely want it to be private, because then I know for a fact that these teams cannot be found when I search for a team. They're no longer discoverable, as well as we just discussed. All right, back to my presentation. So now let's move into these compliance features of Microsoft Teams. First of all, I want to talk about the expiration policy. And like I said before, this is something that you configure on Azure AD, so on the Microsoft 365 groups policies, and not on a Teams level. This is not a Teams policy, it's a groups policy. So you have to go to Azure AD, and there you go to your settings, and you will find the expiration policy there, and you can set a certain number of days, and after that amount of days, if a group has not been touched, so in this case, for this session, let's talk about Teams. If that team has not been touched, then the team will automatically be deleted after 90 days. And first you will get a warning 30 days on beforehand, then 15 days on beforehand, then 1 day prior to the actual expiration. So team owners still have some time to create some activity, and the only thing you need to do is basically visit a channel conversation or access a file in SharePoint. These are all considered as activities, and as soon as an activity has taken place, this counter will be reset and it will start counting back from 90 again. What is good to know is that you can enable this for all your groups, or you can disable it. Of course, you can set it to none, or you can enable it for selected groups. Now, a feature that I would like to see, and there is a user voice item for this, but unfortunately it's not in the service yet, is the other way around. I would like to select certain groups that should be exempt from this particular policy, because I have already pre-created a couple of teams, maybe for my departments, and these departmental teams, I don't want them to be deleted or expired after 90 days. So I want to make an exception instead of only apply this to certain selected teams. Anyway, let's hope that Microsoft will bring that feature to us shortly. Then we go to naming conventions. There's a couple of things that you can do. You can set a naming convention based on a fixed keyword. So you could say that every team that's being created by someone should be prefixed, for example, by the team dash, or by group dash, or by collaboration dash, or something like that. Or in this case here, I've set a setting that it should start with GRP underscore and then department name, and that's a property that's being read from Azure AD. So when a user creates a team, then the creation process will look at that user and it will create a team with the name grp underscore, and then it looks at the department for that user, and then it will attach the group name that the user has typed in while creating the group. Another interesting thing here is you can change custom blocked word lists. So you can set up certain words that are not allowed when you create a new team. Maybe you don't want people in your organization to create a new team with payroll in the name, or CEO in the name, or HR in the name. Funny story that I have is there's a school, a big school in the south of the Netherlands that was a customer of ours. And students in that school found out that that Teams was released, or not Teams, but the Office 365 groups, as it was called back then. It was released before the IT department of that school found out. So what the students in that school did, they created an Office 365 group with a shared mailbox called something like Exam Committee. And they started sending out emails to teachers. Hey, there is an exam tomorrow. Can you already send the exam to us so that we can publish it on the internet as soon as the exam has passed? They send out emails like this, and it took a couple of days before the school realized that students abused the system, or maybe not abused, well, for the school, of course, but I like the innovative way of thinking of the students and how they found out this exists. So in a school, it could be useful to exempt the words exam or committee or something like that from creating a team. It's also possible to do this in the UI. This capabilities have been added, I think half a year ago, maybe a little bit longer. Before it was only possible through PowerShell, but now you can do this in the UI as well. Again, in Azure AD. So not in the Teams Admin Center, but in the Azure AD Admin Center. You can set up retention policies. So Teams, like I said, ingests all the messages into Exchange. So these retention policies are actually applied to Exchange mailboxes and not so much on the Teams core storage services. But this is still a way to make sure that messages are not deleted after a certain time or before a certain period of time. And it is possible to archive a team if you want to. This is an interesting feature because what it basically does, it doesn't really archive a team in terms of moving it to a different storage or moving it to somewhere else. Basically all it does, it creates a read-only version of that team. It changes the permissions for that team and makes sure that it's read-only for all active members. So it's useful. You could use this feature and then maybe strip permissions and only allow, or I don't know, maybe the team owners or some service owners to be the owner of that particular team. But if you want to use this, you could use this feature. And then the last topic, and we're almost through time as well, is the Microsoft Graph API. And why am I telling about this? Because again, like I said, if you want to build something to provision teams on your through your own mechanism, or if you want to have people fill out a form and then maybe have a approval process in place, or maybe you want more than just a single naming policy, because the naming policies that we just discussed, it's only possible to create one naming policy, but maybe you would like all your teams for projects to be starting with project dash, and for the department starting with depth dash or something similar. Then you have to create something yourself. And you could use the Microsoft Graph API to create teams or to insert messages in a newly created team, things like that. So that's the last demo that I have. I'm going to the Graph Explorer. So here we have the Graph Explorer, and if I go down here, you can see that there is a couple of examples already. So I can get an overview of all the teams that I joined. I can get an overview of all the members of the team that I joined, etc. So what I'm going to do first, let me switch back to Teams, and here I have my Graph channel. So here I created a message, welcome to my Graph demo. Let's see if we can reply to this message through the Graph API. It should appear here in this conversation. So what I did, if I go to my history, I ran this query first. So in this query, I can find it basically checks, it gets all the messages in my channel. So first I already queried which channels do I have, then I get the channel ID, then I can query with messages do I have. And here you can see it has a subject. Let's see if we can reply to this message through the Graph API. You can see that I created this message, etc. And here I have the message ID. And now I go to my text here. So I already created the post reply. So this is the URL that I should type in. And we're not going to do a get, but a post. And what do we want to post? We want to post this little JSON package. This browser here. And let's run this query. And oops. Let's do it like this, run the query. All right, and it was created. And now if I go back to Teams, here you see an additional message, you're an awesome audience. And this is how you can use the Graph API, because I use the Graph Explorer here, but you can also use Power Automate or Logic Apps or your own service, your own way of using the Graph API to create teams, but also to create a welcoming message in a newly created team, for example, where you maybe point out to the rules of engagement that you have inside your organization. All right, that was it. Let me go back to my closing slides. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Again, here's my Twitter handle. I would also like to tell you that you can use the Scottish Summit 2021 hashtag to talk about the conference on Twitter if you want to. And all the sessions are being recorded. In fact, this already is a recording. And all the sessions will be published to YouTube, I think within 14 days or so. All right, I hope you enjoyed this session. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye.